Paul's purpose in Antioch was to organize his second missionary journey and to bring early Gentile Christians already living there the various edicts laid down by the Council of Jerusalem. To abstain from eating the meat of animals that has been sacrificed to pagan idols. To abstain from eating meat that has not been thoroughly drained of blood. To abstain from the meat of animals strangled or carrion left by predators or the remains of animals killed accidentally. To abstain from any act of sexual immorality. But tension still existed between Gentile and Jewish Christians. When Peter visited Paul in Antioch, he refused to eat with the Gentile converts, a direct insult to Paul. Even Paul's ally Barnabas sided with Peter, and he too would not eat with Gentiles. Feeling betrayed, Paul parted company with Barnabas, but perhaps there was more to their falling out.
The more I follow in Paul's footsteps, the greater admiration I have for his endurance. I can imagine the apostle and his companions walking thousands of miles along roads such as this one, just north of Tarsus, a route that he took on his second missionary journey.
By now, Paul had been joined by Silas for his second missionary journey. They began by revisiting the churches in Derbe and Lystra. But it was on the road to Iconium and Pisidian Antioch that Paul had another vision. A direct call to leave the work in Asia Minor and to concentrate his efforts elsewhere. Paul travelled to Troas, and while there he had to decide whether to end his journey or continue on to Europe. A further vision appeared to answer his question with a call to go to Macedonia to preach. In the company of a physician named Luke, Paul set sail for what is now modern Greece. Luke would later write the account of the early years of Christianity that has come down to us as the Acts of the Apostles, as well as the gospel that bears his own name. Paul landed in the Greek city of Neapolis, where he set foot on European soil for the first time. Neapolis means new city in Greek. Under the Roman Empire, it was a prosperous seaport.
I'm wondering what Paul must have felt as he stepped ashore here at Neapolis in northern Greece. His voyage had taken him from one continent to another, from Asia to Europe. It was a daunting prospect, an ambitious prospect, and in some ways a risky one too, yet it transformed the opportunities open to him.
Paul's next stop was Philippi, 12 miles inland. I had read of Philippi's history in my studies, but I wasn't prepared for the magnificent ruins that still radiate the power and the greatness of the Roman Empire.
This in Philippi is a stretch of an old Roman road, the Via Egnatia. Originally it ran 700 miles from the Adriatic Sea to the Aegean Sea. It was built to allow Roman armies swift transit across the empire. But to Paul and his companions, roads such as this were vital arteries as they sought to spread the Christian word. When Paul came to Philippi, he chose this beautiful, peaceful location about a mile outside town to begin his preaching. From his audience of a group of women stepped forward Lydia, a seller of purple cloth. Paul brought her to this river, and Lydia holds the distinction of being the first recorded baptism in Europe. We must remember that ancient society, like Paul's, had a much greater sense of everyone belonging together. Of course individuals mattered, but society mattered more. So, if a head of a household was baptized, then more often than not, the rest of his family would follow suit. Time and again in Acts, we read of individuals and families being baptized on the same occasion. And this is what happens with Lydia.
Lydia was baptized here, and immediately after the baptism, she kindly asked Paul and his company, Silas, Luke, and Timothy, to visit her house. That night, Lydia's family and relatives were baptized and became Christians. And with this simple and quiet way, Lydia's relatives created the first church, the first home church in Philippi.
Before leaving Philippi, Paul encountered a slave woman who he believed was possessed because she was able to tell fortunes, an ability which earned money for her masters.
Paul was utterly fed up with this. He snapped, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I order you to come out of her." The slave girls' owners were furious at this treatment of their property. They had Paul and Silas dragged before the magistrate here in the forum. Without ceremony, the men were whipped, beaten, and sent to prison.
According to tradition, Paul and Silas were chained in this prison.
As Paul and Silas knelt in prayer, a providential earthquake struck the town and the prison door fell open. The jailer was terrified his captives were going to flee. But Paul, showing a stubborn streak, refused to move until the magistrate came to apologize for the earlier beating. Paul was, after all, a Roman citizen.
Paul left Philippi for Thessaloniki, but Luke stayed behind. Thessaloniki is now the second largest city in Greece, a hub for international commerce. In Paul's day, it was home to many prosperous merchants because it was a major seaport that also straddled a key overland trading route, the Via Egnatia. Many of Thessaloniki's merchants sold their wares here, in what was once the busy market district. With dozens of stores packed side by side, today it looks like the ruins of an ancient shopping centre.
In Philippi, Paul had enjoyed the support of the wealthy Lydia, but here in Thessaloniki, he had no such patron. He writes of having to work night and day at his trade of tent making just to make ends meet. Yet his preaching went well. His message of the humble Messiah struck a chord with many of the people here, and a great multitude of the Greeks were won over.
In Thessaloniki, Paul was a house guest of a man named Jason. While staying there, Paul was converting Greek Gentiles, but he was also preaching the kingdom of God to Greek Jews, and many were converted.
But the Jews became jealous, and with the help of some ruffians in the marketplaces, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. While they were searching for Paul and Silas to bring them out to the assembly, they attacked Jason's house.
As usual, Paul's success provoked opposition from some in the Jewish community. They brought his associates before the local magistrate and accused the Christians of promoting the interests of their own king above that of the emperor. The men managed to post bail, but this was a bad sign. Once again, things had become too hot, and Paul and Silas had to slip away from here. Although Paul had to make a hasty exit, the first Christian community in Thessaloniki had been established. And Paul didn't leave it to fend for itself. Even though he couldn't be there in person, he could support it through writing.
Paul's 2 letters to the Thessalonians are the first of these, and, like all his later letters, they were written in response to a particular question or problem. In this case, the question was this: if the Lord is returning soon, as he promised, what is the point of thinking too far ahead about the future? Why, for example, carry on working?
Paul's answer is to say yes, we believe that Jesus is returning soon, but that's no excuse for inaction. Instead, you must live your lives with hope and as if he were here already. That means you don't give up living a good life. From Thessaloniki, Paul came 50 miles southwest here to Berea.
After founding the first Christian churches in Europe, the Apostle Paul travelled 200 miles southwards to see, for the first time, the grandeur of Athens.
When he reached Athens, Paul met a breathtaking sight. It had been the greatest city of the ancient world. It was full of shrines and sanctuaries, dominated then as now by the Parthenon, the Temple of Athena.
Athens was a bastion of paganism, with literally dozens of temples crowding the city. In fact, according to a popular saying from Paul's time, it was easier to find a god in Athens than a man.
This was the Agora, a place of trade, chatter and intellectual sparring. In other words, the ideal place for Paul to start his preaching. Local philosophers began to dispute with him. While they found his message of Jesus and the resurrection a little strange, there was something in his words that intrigued them. In Athens, Paul had seen an altar inscribed with the words, "To an unknown God." He used this as an opportunity to explain Christianity.
Here on the marble outcropping called Mars Hill, Paul addressed some of the most learned men of Greece. As we learn from the book of Acts, Paul's sermon about the unknown God is one of his most famous and convincing speeches.
What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you, the God who made the world and everything in it.
Paul saw the profusion of temples and gods not as an obstacle, but as a sign of religious hunger. He was keen as ever to engage in debate.
He spoke of Jesus, a man raised from the dead, but on this point he lost his audience. The Athenians believed in the survival of the soul and not the body. They mocked him. "We'll listen to you again another time on this matter," they said. In other words, don't call us, we'll call you.
Paul's work in Athens had convinced a few people, men and women, and the seeds of a Christian community were planted. My destination was Corinth. During Paul's time, Corinth was surpassing Athens in both size and political importance.
This is ancient Corinth, a far cry from conservative Athens, an energetic, entrepreneurial place, a boom town, a melting pot. In many respects, a bare canvas for Paul to work from.
Paul realized that he couldn't do everything, and he wanted situations which would multiply his efforts. So that his first real missionary center was Corinth, which was one of the hubs of the ancient world. There were travelers coming in and out, going in all directions.
In the year 49, the Jews were expelled from Rome, and many went to Corinth. The experiences of the Jews in Rome made them more receptive to new ideas such as Paul's. In Corinth, Paul's message reached people from all backgrounds and all levels of society.
This is an inscription in the theatre at Corinth. It says that Erastus, a Roman official, had paid for this pavement. I'm intrigued by this because this Erastus could be the same man mentioned by Paul as the city treasurer and as an associate of his. This was important. Paul had decided he needed to target men of means and status who could offer support and meeting places for his new recruits.
Paul's success in Corinth continued for most of the 18 months he spent there.
As Paul became established in Corinth, he won over more and more converts, pagans and Jews alike. The latter group, however, began to fight back. They accused Paul of trying to persuade people to worship contrary to the law. They had him dragged to trial here at the Great Platform. But the presiding Roman official threw the case out. He said it was simply a matter of internal Jewish feuding.
When Paul left Corinth, his destination was Antioch. But to sail there, he first had to travel by road to Cenchreae, 8 miles away.
In Paul's day, this was part of an enormous trading complex that brought together merchants from Europe and the Middle East. It was an ideal hub for this leg of his missionary work. One of the inhabitants of Cenchreae was a woman named Phoebe. She was praised as a faithful servant of the church, and she offered help to many, including Paul himself. She was just part of the vital network of volunteers so crucial in establishing early Christianity.
The help that Phoebe gave Paul may have included material support, much as Lydia had provided earlier. Paul's second missionary journey had been a great success. He had founded many new churches and converted countless Gentiles and Jews to Christianity.